Hey guys, Sam here. Welcome to my library. It's late. The lighting is different. It's a little awkward right now. I know you can get a glare on my glasses. I'm going to try to fix that for the next video. But I really want to do a series on Waverly Hills leading up to a video about my own experience at Waverly. But before we get into that, we kind of have to talk about the history of the place. Big fan of Waverly. So let's get into it and let's talk about Waverly. So I've been wanting to make this video for a while, but I wasn't really sure how to go about it. I ended up discussing my story with someone who was working on a project related to Waverly, and I decided I should just stop putting it off and do it. But to get into the experiences I and other people have had at Waverly, we really have to get into what it was, how it was built, why it was built. So I thought I would do part one about that, about Waverly and the history behind it, and then talk about my personal story later on. So growing up in Kentucky, I knew about Waverly from a fairly young age. We talked about it in different grade levels, discussing, Kentucky history. The hospital is actually located in Louisville, which is about 2 hours, give or take, from where I live in eastern Kentucky. And the original structure for Waverly was opened in 1910. Now, when people talk about early 1900s America and things that were going on at the time, a big thing that comes up is the Spanish flu pandemic, which started in 1918. History tends to forget about the White Plague, which was tuberculosis. And it started much earlier than the Spanish flu did. And it was a very nasty disease. It attacked the lungs. There was no cure. For a long time, they didn't even know what to do to treat it. And it became very prevalent in Jefferson County, Kentucky, which is where Louisville's located. And a lot of people fell ill with tuberculosis because it's part of the Ohio River Valley. A lot of lowlands that are very, wet, marshy. It was a breeding ground for tuberculosis bacteria. So they became so inundated with these people suffering from TB that they built this 2-story hospital on Waverly Hill. And you can see it here. Very simple structure. I can't remember the exact number of patients it held, but it wasn't a lot. But it became evident very quickly that this wasn't going to cut it. There just wasn't enough room for all of the sick and dying people. So as they began to outgrow this wooden structure that wasn't meant to last forever, they were like, well, we have to have something bigger and more permanent because this isn't going away. So in 1924, the 5-story brick building that we know today as Waverly opened. And it's truly massive. And you can kind of get a sense from videos and television programs how big it is. But when you see it in person, you understand this was a massive hospital. And it was built to house 400 patients. Now, at the time, that was a large hospital. Not only was it a large hospital, it didn't take other patients. There were no cancer patients, heart attack patients, people with other diseases and ailments. This was just for tuberculosis patients. So the fact that it holds 400 people, and it's, one of many that would be built across the country, it gives you an idea of the scope of how immense the White Plague was, how prevalent it was, how many people were dying from it. As they begin to study tuberculosis, they're like, well, part of the cure, or at least treatment, is fresh air. So on these floors, one half of the hall opens onto these promenades, these verandas, these open air areas. So you would have your doors to your room, and when they opened on this side, they opened into this like promenade with just open air. And they would take you out there in your wheelchair, in your bed, even in the winter, because they truly believed that fresh air for the lungs would help you. So you had the front, well, I guess technically the back half, but this half of the hospital opening into these fresh air verandas. So if you had a possibility of getting better, that is where you would be. If you were moved to the other side of the hall, I don't want to say outright it was a death sentence, but it was bad because they didn't think you would get better. So you kind of knew if you were taken from the fresh air side to the side that is, just opens, has just windows that opens to the back of the building, and your doors just open to the hallway, your chances were not good. So they were trying this fresh air approach. And they were also doing these experimental surgeries and things like, cracking open your ribs, going in, trying to scrape scar tissue from your lungs, trying to deflate your lungs and deflating them like a balloon, basically, to try to give your lungs a chance to heal. And a lot of times these were not successful. And a lot of times the patients died during or after surgery because there wasn't a cure and they didn't know. And they were trying all these things just to keep people alive. Nobody really knows how many people died at Waverly Hills. In the thousands, for sure. We're not talking like 50,000, 20,000, but 10,000 or less. Probably around the 5-ish range, maybe 3. Still a lot of people. What people now think of when they think of Waverly a lot of the times is the body chute. Now, what people call the body chute was not made for that intended purpose. It was a tunnel built from the train tracks to the top of the hill for bringing up supplies when building the hospital. But as they begin to get inundated with these deaths and people were dying at such a quick rate, that they would take the dead, put them on gurneys, move them down this tunnel to the train tracks at the bottom to be taken away. Later on, when people were dying at such fast rates and they were inundated with death, in order to save patient morale, they would put the dead on gurneys, take them down this tunnel to the train tracks where they would be taken away and, dealt with appropriately and put to rest. And, that was so the people who were trying to recover weren't aware that all these people were dying from the same disease. Like, can you imagine being in a hospital, hoping that you're going to make it, and all of these people are dying and you have to see that. So, it wouldn't have been good for them. So this was the way that they dealt with that. And tuberculosis, it wasn't discriminatory. It hit everybody from the elderly to people, my age in their 30s, young people. There were children. The 5th floor of Waverly was the children's ward. And one side were, the regular tuberculosis, the lungs. It can not metastasize, I guess isn't the word, but it could go to your brain. So then there was a side that was for brain tuberculosis. And there weren't just sick children there. If you were a child and your parents or your caretakers were in Waverly for TB, you lived there. Waverly Hills was not just a hospital. It was almost its own town. It had its own zip code. Because if you came there to work as a nurse or a doctor, janitorial staff, all these things hospitals have to have, you lived there. You could not leave because you could carry tuberculosis back to your home, spread it more. You were part of this community. You were part of Waverly Hills. They couldn't risk you carrying TB around and giving it to even more people and creating more cases. So you had to stay. Eventually, streptomycin was created as a cure for tuberculosis. They started administering it around 1943. Cases began to decline, and by 1961, Waverly Hills Sanitorium shut its doors. It was no longer needed. They didn't have the number of patients that they had before, and those who still got tuberculosis, and tuberculosis still exists today. You would go to just your local hospital and be treated there with streptomycin, and most recovered and, went on to live their life. So Waverly would eventually reopen in 1962 as the Woodhaven Geriatric Center. The nursing home took care of mostly dementia patients, people with mobility issues, and some who, suffered from different mental handicaps, and, they couldn't take care of themselves. It closed just 20 years later in 1982 because, they lacked staff, they were overcrowded, and there were a lot of reports of neglect. It was not a good place. So Woodhaven Geriatric Center closed down, and the building sat empty for a while. It was purchased by a man who was going to turn it into a prison. Those plans fell through. It was then purchased by another guy who wanted to use I think he was going to tear it down. I can't remember exactly, or if he was going to build the statue on top of the building, but he wanted to build a statue of Jesus that would be the biggest in the world and would outshine Christ the Redeemer in Brazil. This fell through. So this building sat empty, neglected, lots of graffiti, kids breaking in, people sneaking up the hill, on and on and on, vandalized, windows busted out. As you can see, it looked pretty bad. So then it was bought privately by the current owners. It's privately owned, and it's now open for the public to tour. You can't just go on your own. You have to have a tour. There's day tours, history tours, overnights, which is what I did. And they're working really hard to restore the building and restore the history, and it's going really great, and it's looking fantastic. So Waverly kind of got a new life breathed into it. And all of these paranormal shows, like Ghost Hunters, went there and did an overnight. Sam and Colby from YouTube have been there. TFIL from YouTube have been there. There's been some other YouTubers and people recently who have been there, and they're kind of introducing Waverly and its haunts to a whole new generation of people. So in my next video, I want to talk about some of the more famous spirits, famous, episodes of these shows, famous hauntings caught on camera, including what happened in room 502, which is indisputably the most famous room at Waverly. So if you're interested, stick around for part 2, which we'll talk about that, and then part 3, where I'm going to tell you what happened to me at Waverly. And it's a very personal story, and it's, it's something I still almost can't believe myself. So, yeah, stick around. It's going to be a good time. See you later. Bye.